already on our website. So with that, I guess I'll get going. And so as we talk about race committee and we talk about responsibilities, I'm just going to kind of, breeze through this. But one of the things is and I don't know how much of this is going to apply to this year, again, depending on how our sailing season goes, but the head judge, typically we should contact the members of our race committee at least a week prior, I would recommend, so that, we can make sure that we have people present. And otherwise, sometimes also you find out somebody switched with somebody, and so that's good information to know as well. In addition, then as far as our just normal club duties, I mean, we got to do the club care, cleaning, sweeping of the clubhouse and restocking the bathrooms, etc. If there's any supplies that are low, we need to get a hold of either a board member or buildings and grounds typically, or we need to take care of getting the supplies or arrange to have somebody get them. Of course, over the summer, over the week of our duty, we take care of the lawn cutting and cleaning, taking care, sometimes weed whacking, etc. We usually try to do that on a non-racing day when the club's not being used as much. So that would be a recommendation. The docks, cleaning off goose stuff. And if there's any repairs or something, I mean, if it's something simple, obviously we take care of it. Otherwise, we may need, if there's something that needs a repair, we may need to talk to Docks and Waterfront or in lieu of whoever's doing Docks and Waterfront, if my dad's not on the board, we also might need to talk to my dad because he takes care of a lot of that stuff. The other thing that a lot of people tend to forget about is putting up our flag. We do have a U.S. flag that we like to fly, and occasionally that gets forgotten, but we should put it up when we're sailing. And then if we're not the last to leave, depending on who's there, you might be able to make arrangements for somebody else to take it down, or if not, then take it down before you go. One of the other unpleasant things, but sometimes is needed, is they are actually responsible for protest committee if we need that. Now, there are times we finish either sailing late at night or, things don't work out that a protest can't be heard the same day. Generally, we would try to hear them the same day, but there are times when that does not happen. So arrangements can be needed, made to do a protest later, but generally speaking, we try to take care of those the same day. So just with going through that, we're going to go on to the next things. And so let's start talking about race courses. And again, a lot of this is going to be specific to Lake Fenton, but a lot of the concepts apply to wherever you're sailing. And so my dad had written some things about how to set a sailboat race course, and I've borrowed some of his information. So again, this will be published later. I don't really want to necessarily read through everything that's on here, but one of the big points about sailboat racing is that about 70% of a race generally is to do with the windward legs. The other parts, even though, when I say 70% of the racing, and I think my dad would say the same thing, it may not necessarily be 70% of the distance all the time, but the majority of the passing, the majority of the actual race happening is on the weathered legs. So the idea is that we want to set as good of weathered legs as we can and as long of weathered legs as we can. Now, the lake is not always laid out, depending on the wind direction, to set the longest legs possible. But one of the things that we need to look at is that, can we get in at least about a mile or more of upwind sailing? And so what you'll notice in this is that you might have one or two legs. So in the case of having one lap, but it may have two separate weather legs in particular on Lake Fenton. And so we tend to sail a lot of the figure 8 courses, and the idea is to set as much upwind work as we can. And so this, all of this is talking about really the idea that we want to set as much upwind as we can. So looking at that on Lake Fenton, so for those not familiar with their lake, this is the north shore. Case Island sits in the middle of the lake, and we sail from Case Island to the north shore, basically. So these marked zones are just basically clockwise these represent zones. And so what we're looking at is how we lay out a course on Lake Fenton. But the point that we want to make in setting up the course in this is that if you're setting a course that's the length of the lake, and it doesn't matter if you're going 1-4 or 2-5, usually when the wind is going down the lake, it's less critical as far as whether you set the leeward end or the leeward end or the windward end first. In other words, you could set mark 4 here and then go down and set mark 1, or you could do vice versa. You can set mark 1 and you can go and set mark 4. And so what we're saying is that usually when the wind's lengthwise with the lake, you don't get quite as much effect. So looking at it from either end, you usually get a fairly reasonable result. When we look at the lake, though, when the wind's going a little more crossways, this is when it becomes more important to set the leeward mark first, okay? So in this case, the wind's blowing, so we're going to sail, we're gonna sail from 3 to 5, so we're going against the wind. We're gonna go down to 2, that's our next number here. We're gonna sail against the wind to mark 1. In this case, where the wind starts to go across the lake more and the lake is much more narrow, this is a time when it actually is more important to set the leeward mark first. So in this case, for these two weather legs, we'd set the leeward mark at 2 first, and then we would take a read of that flag, of that mark, and we would use that reference to motor up to actually set mark 1. If you try to set mark 1, the problem is you get too much interference from the shorelines, from the trees, from the houses, etc. You get a much truer read of the wind if you start from the leeward end when you're working across the lake. The other thing that you'll notice with this course, and it's fairly typical on Lake Fenton in particular, because we have this point here and we have the point of the club, is that you'll have the two weather legs, but they may not be necessarily parallel to one another. You would think that they would be, but because of the lay of the lake and because of the interference of the land, they are not necessarily parallel to one another. They're both upwind, but they're not the same as each. You know, they're not parallel, because you can see the wind is a little bit different in each case. So you would treat these weather legs separately. And so the idea in setting the course is, even though we look at the course and we say, okay, we're going 5, 2, 1, you really don't have to think about 5 to 2. The idea is that you're trying to set 2 of the best weather legs that you can set. Now, going back to the long course, a lot of times we look at this and we say, okay, sailing a windward leeward course, we want to set an offset, and the idea of the offset is to separate the boats a little bit, getting around the windward mark. So some instructions in there on setting the offset is that it should be a very short leg, only about 40 to 45 yards long. So we're talking, you know, less than 150 feet. And the other thing is it shouldn't be a right angle going across. It should start to bend back a little bit. So recommendation is about a 70-degree change. So when you get around the windward mark, the offset should be less than 150 feet, and it should be at about a 70-degree angle and not at a right angle. And so in our case, the offset is always marked by a yellow flag. And so in this case, it's showing that you're round 4 and then you're round the offset and then go back to the original starting point. So when we talk about setting courses, there's a lot of different options on Lake Fenton. And you saw, I'll go back to one of the maps real quick. I mean, you see these are, again, our locations or vicinities. We don't, we use movable marks all the time. So depending on the direction, one could be down here in the hole, or it could be up here on the west shore. So when we set these courses, those are relative locations. So those are, this just gives you an idea of how long, if you do a single lap, and how long if you do 2 laps, that these courses should be. So we don't worry about the off winds. We mostly worry about setting the upwinds, and we try to get at least a mile or more of weather leg in. So that could be between 2 legs. It could be done mostly in 1 leg. That's another reason also why we typically sail a lap and a leg, because we like to finish to windward to have as much windward work as we can. So, all right, before we get into setting the starting line, does anybody got any questions regarding that?
Scott as well. Do you have any questions? Or?
I'm barely hearing somebody.
I've been hearing me.
Okay.
All right.
I'm going to go downstairs.
I didn't hear anybody, so am I supposed to go on, Sue?
Yep.
Okay. So let's talk about setting the starting lines. So one of the rules of thumb of setting the starting line is that you should have about 1.5 boat length for the number of boats starting. And I'm going to say, we'll say the largest number of boats starting. So you need to think about how long the line should be. The idea being that the boats ought to be able to at least line up end to end on the line. We realize that the actual starts are always a rolling time, so the boats may not ever be technically end to end on the line, but the point being that there should be enough room for them to be end to end on the line. Now, this point here is, for some people, seems to be a little bit debatable, but we're going to go through why we say that the committee boat should be on the starboard end. There's a couple of different reasons. One is that, and I'll show it in a diagram in just a minute, but talks a little bit about keeping boats from sailing directly over the anchor lines. And then another thing is it reduces potential collisions. Again, I have a diagram in a couple of pages here that'll show some of the concerns. When we set the leeward end of the line, so we're assuming that we're setting the committee boat on the starboard end and we're setting the mark on the port on the leeward, that it should be about 1 boat to 1.5 boat length ahead of the committee boat. And the point of that is actually to slightly favor the leeward end of the line, because what that does is it tends to spread the boats down the line better. Again, I have some diagrams that'll show a little bit about this. This is kind of a general thing. Doesn't matter whether you're driving our boat or any boat. When you're getting ready to anchor a committee boat to set it as an end of a line, you need to motor ahead of where you want to be and drop your anchor lines and then let your anchors out so that you can drift back to the place that you need to be. One of the mistakes that sometimes people make is they don't drive far enough ahead. And anybody that's driven the committee boat much, you realize that if the heavier the wind is, the farther ahead you need to be. You need to have a little more scope out or a little more angle on the lines in order to hold without having, without dragging the anchors. Obviously, there's different depths in the lake as well. Lake Fenton, the majority of the lake is about 60 feet deep, 50 to 60 or so, but there are some areas that are shallower, but there are some that are a lot deeper as well. Some areas that are actually 90 to 100 feet. So it also depends a little bit on where you're anchoring. But obviously, like I say, you want to be well ahead of where you want to land, and before you drop, excuse me, if I could speak, before you drop your anchors, and then let the anchor lines out to drift back to where you want to end up. Now, as we talked about all that and how to square the line and so forth, this was written by my dad, and this is going to maybe sound a little bit funny, but the recommendations is that, if you're raising your arms out parallel and then you are looking down the line, you should see the leeward mark just ahead of your hand. So if you can look at my screen real quick, I mean, we're just talking about having your arms out to your sides. And as you're looking down from the front where the flag is, you should see the starting mark ahead of your left hand. So you're looking into the wind, you're squaring yourself with the wind. And as you look down, that starting mark should be ahead. Now, it sounds easy, and I can honestly say that I've screwed it up before. I have thought that I had the boat far enough back or the flag far enough ahead, and turned out I didn't. So one of the things that's a recommendation, though, of actually how to determine if you think you're in the right place or not, and how square to the wind you are. You can make changes in the line up till the preparatory flag. So in our case, the preparatory flag is 3 minutes, or the blue flag just before. So I have also made adjustments where decided that I was still a little too far forward. And sometimes in that 3 minute window, after the yellow flag goes up, but before the blue flag, I've let the committee boat drift back just a little bit. And so something that you need to be aware of when you can make changes. And then he's just got some tips here of, obviously if the fleet's all the way down the line, you did pretty well. If you've got most of the fleet at the pin, then the boat was too far back. If you've got most of the fleet at the committee boat, then you weren't far enough back. In other words, the committee boat was too much favored. But the biggest key, especially on Sundays, is, we've got 2 races. So if the first one doesn't go well, if everybody was bunched up at one end of the line or the other, use that information to improve on the next start. And so as we take a look at some of the diagrams I had, so one of the things that we talked about in there and why we like to see the committee boat on the starboard end. So these are my anchor lines. The boats can't, because they got to clear the end of the committee boat, it can't be too awful close to the committee boat. So they can't turn immediately. He has to turn, as you cross the line, they're going to cross farther out. If the committee boat's down here and the boat crosses right in front, it's going to cross right over the highest part of the anchor lines, because they'd be coming from this direction. So just out of natural avoidance of the boat itself, by having the boat on the starboard end, it actually forces the boats to be farther away as if they, even if they tack is, you know, immediately to port. The other thing that happens is, let's say that you have a boat down here that was trying a port tack start, and for whatever reason, it doesn't work out. If the pin is here, the boat can just turn and bail out. Or worst case, the boat just hits the pin and there's very little damage, if anything, to the boat or to the pin, and they just have to restart. Let's look at it from the, if we have the boat down here, there's no place for this guy to go. So this guy has to be over the line to avoid this one, and this guy can't turn directly into the boat. And I've been this guy, and I can tell you it's not fun because there's so the biggest thing is that this situation doesn't have to happen. And so even though it's only a potential, it's an unnecessarily created potential by choosing to put the boat down here. And so that's one of the reasons why we recommend that it always is on the starboard end. Okay. Let's talk about race sequences. Now this comes directly out of our sailing instructions. When we're done here, I'm going to show you where those are found on the website. But our signal is it's a 3-minute sequence, our normal sequence. And so if you follow this, you've got initially the horn and you have the yellow going up. So the horns only happen when flags go up. The horns never happen, or should never happen, when a flag comes down. Okay, so up, yes. Down, no. I mean, that's just a rule of thumb. I circle or put this in a box because, again, we talked about the preparatory flag, and so you can make, even if you put the yellow flag up and then you think you need to move the committee boat up a little bit forward or back a little bit, you've still got that 3-minute window in which you can do it. So we start with the yellow. That's 6 minutes to the first start. That comes down. So it's every flag is up for 2.5 minutes and then down for 30 seconds. So if you look, we have a copy of this that's on the committee boat with the clipboard for the instructions. And so it's depending on what, if you're using a countdown or a count up, I mean, this labels each flag for you. So the big key is to start with the yellow. It comes down, blue goes up 3 minutes to the first start. And then in our case, because we have the 4 fleets, once the red goes up, the red comes down, and then the red goes back up for each subsequent start. This one is actually showing for the Sundays. The sequence is actually different for the Wednesdays. And on the Wednesdays, we've actually been having the open fleet start first. And then we've actually been having the Sea Scows and the Cats, I think, start together. And that is in our race instructions as well. Again, I will show you where that is at. Let's talk about the finish line. So the finish line is generally half as long as the starting line. Kind of my rule of thumb is I don't like to see a finish line that's any less than about five boats or so worth. I've seen some really small finish lines. I've seen some really big ones, but on the finish line, the tendency seems to be for people to set them to be smaller And I think sometimes we get in the habit of doing that because we're thinking that in general, you're going to have, 1, 2, or maybe 3 boats finishing at a time. What happens though is a lot of times if we have a shorter race, 1 lap and a leg, you do have sometimes more than 3 boats trying to finish at the same time. And especially in our case, when we have the multi-fleets, some of the catamarans and sea scows and things need a little more maneuvering room than some of our smaller boats, Rebel and so forth. So I generally don't like to see it any shorter than 5 boats, 5 boat lengths. One of the other things is that the finished boat, in this case, should always be on the outside of the race course. So it's basically so that you're rounding the mark in the same way that you would when they went around the first time. Another difference in the finish line versus the starting line is the starting line we're trying to set basically perpendicular to the wind with the windward end favored just a little bit. The finish line, because sometimes, and you get this more with the shorter courses and when the wind is a little bit more across the lake, sometimes you get the tendency where the wind is shifting a bit more. And the tendency is to try to set sometimes the finish line with the being perpendicular to the wind. But in reality, it's supposed to be perpendicular to the leg, regardless of the wind direction. Now, typically that's not going to be, 20 or 30 degrees off. It's going to look like it's fairly close to perpendicular to the wind, but it may not be exactly perpendicular. And just like in the starting line, obviously use your anchor lines to adjust the position. So let's take a look real quick what the finish line should look like. So this is a case, and I kind of maybe overdrew this just for the point, but if I'm going to be perpendicular to the course, the wind may not be perpendicular to the finish line, and that's not, that's just the way that it is, especially if you're working in close quarters to the shoreline. And so it's important to understand this concept. And the reason is because you want both ends of the line to be equidistant from the starting area. You're trying not to favor one end or the other. Now, because of the wind, sometimes one end is favored versus the other, but that's up to the sailors to decide. It's not up to the committee to try to figure that out for them. So you're trying to set the finish line perpendicular to the leg. Let's see. Let's talk about scoring. So I've got the score sheet here we'll look at in just a minute, but some of the key points. You're supposed to record the warning signal time. And so in our score sheets, we're going to be recording time of day. We need to record the time of day for the finish for the catamarans, and we also had in there for each of the open fleet boats. Both of these, you got to include the seconds in what we're recording, and this is important for doing the handicaps. If you get the times of day in there, I mean, eventually they have to calculate the elapsed time, but that can all be done later. If you get the time of day in there, then it really makes it so you can always go back and figure out anything that needs to be figured out. So with time of day, I think it's also a lot faster than trying to sit there and figure out an elapsed time or something of that nature. So we're just recording time of day. Even with the other fleets that are not handicapped, MCs and Sea Scouts and so forth, we still like to see the time of day for the first finish. And that just is that way. It also verifies that we've made the time limits of a race, and there's nothing that could be contested later. And so just a note that, like I said, there's fewer arguments. There's, we don't have to worry about the time limit. And also you can figure out everything else using the time of day. So just take a quick look at the score sheet. So up here is where we talked about that we put the times of the warning signals. And then in here is your time of day for the races. And this one's time of day for the first boat. So in the case of the Sea Scows and that, you're just going to have a sail number in there, LF3 and LF4, 11, so forth. Whoever's first, just record their time of day. You don't have to worry about the rest of them necessarily. So, and I think with that, the only other thing I just wanted to cover real quick, just so people have understand it or have seen it, and this also is on our website, and I'll show you. This is just a clip or an excerpt out of applying the handicaps. When we do those, I mean, this is the way that the calculation is actually done. So you have you're calculating the time, the corrected time. And so you're taking the elapsed time divided by the handicap time times 100 basically. And so I did just a quick example. And these are handicaps that we were using right now at Fenton. The open fleet has not actually been using handicaps, but when we did, I think these were the last numbers that I recall. And so for instance, the Rebel that finished in 45 minutes, it has a handicap of 93, do the calculation. So that 45 minutes was adjusted to 48.39. A Lightning that actually beat the Rebel by 2 minutes. So they finished the lapse time of 43 minutes. But with the smaller handicap, actually the calculation comes out to 49.42. So the Rebel actually beat the Lightning in this case, even though on the water, the Lightning beat them by 2 minutes. So this is just an example. Again, because we do need to do the seconds in the calculations. So obviously, I mean, this is going to be a 45 point something seconds, and this is going to be a 43 point something seconds when we do the calculation. But that's why we have calculators.
Is that Portsmouth, or is that
these were originally the Portsmouth, yes. And so I wanted to share real quick. So on our website, if you go to our section that is the LFC members only, and if you haven't already signed in, it'll ask you for your Google account information, etc. So one of the things I wanted to show you was that part of like the race sequence, the flag sequence and those things where I said I borrowed it out of the race committee instructions. The race committee instructions are right here. Now notice below that there's also a race instructions for skippers. The information in these two, a lot of it is similar, but it's not all the same. The race committee instructions also covers things talking about lightning in the area and safety and so forth. And so if anybody hasn't seen this, I would recommend highly that everybody take a read. I know that a lot of effort went into putting all of that information together. And so that's where those two instructions are. Now there's additional information. If you go into the club documents and go down to the bottom where it talks about race management, and there's actually information in here about our anemometer, atomic clock. This right here is what I was saying, was how to use the Portsmouth numbers. And so that's where I've got the information out to show how to apply the calculations. And so also information about the lightning detector. And so right now, I think that's all I had on the race committee. I don't know if there's any questions or anything. Again, all of this will get published
Oh.
and put out.
Really? Yeah.
Hello?
If we're good, I'll go on to,
Well,
I'll go
Mike
on
had,
to rules.
Mike had a question about tracking the time to the first mark for abandoning races.
Yes, and that instruction is in the full set of race instructions that I showed. Those two links that I just showed.
Okay.
But yes, the information is in there about the 30 minutes.
Quick question, Kevin.
Yes.
So for the handicap boats, you don't want us to calculate the time. You want the captains of those fleets to do all the calculations.
Typically, it's been done by the captains. We've just recorded the times is all. So
That makes it easier. I've always calculated the time.
yeah.
He was a hero kid. He was,
I don't think anybody will complain if somebody calculates the time for them.
yeah.
But
remember we
I'm going to say it's not required. So. Okay. With that, the other thing, so this is actually what we're looking at here is the rules. I just wanted to jump back for a moment. That if you also notice down in the race management was that we also have racing rules in here. So these PDF that we're looking at are the racing rules, and we have access to those on the website as well. So let me go back to that. Fresher. Most of this is going to be straightforward to people, and if you've been racing, if you haven't been racing, then this will be. So first of all, particularly when you're opposite tacks, the starboard tack has right of way over the port tack. So basically, it's saying port tack boat shall keep clear. If you're on the same tack and overlap, then it's telling you that the windward boat shall keep clear of the leeward boat. That, again, to most people is fairly straightforward. Now, the one place where these two, so you also see here where rule 12, where boats are on the same tack but not overlapped, then the boat that's astern should keep clear of the boat that's ahead. So in other words, you can't hit them from the back. One of the problems that or one of the things you see is that when the boat from astern starts to overtake the boat ahead, if they try to go to windward, then the leeward boat may actually run them up. So I think everybody's seen, if you're looking at my hands and you've got this boat ahead and this boat behind, he starts to come up and now they're overlapped. Well, then you see them both come up. And so the windward boat has to stay clear. I think in a sense that makes sense to everybody. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in a few weeks when we start talking about a little bit more of strategy and things of not being in the parade of everybody going to windward, so to speak, and those kinds of things. But that's one of the things that people get confused. Now, if you've been sailing for a long time, and I say long time being well before 2017 and before, some people, I had heard there used to be a rule that was called what's the name of it?
Mast to beam.
Mast to beam. Yep. It used to be a rule called mast to beam, and so it was basically the idea that when the overtaking boat got to a certain point, the leeward boat couldn't run up anymore. That has been gone for a while. So if you are the windward boat, you have to keep clear. It doesn't. Unfortunately, the leeward boat can take you to the shoreline if they want to, but again, we'll that's something we'll talk about a little bit more in a couple of weeks. So the other thing, so basically, you know, again, when you're on the same tacks and you're overlapped, windward boats staying clear, that's pretty straightforward to most people. One of the things that people forget is that while you're tacking, you're not technically on a tack. You really have zero rights. So you need to be sure that when you're tacking, that you're not tacking into the course of an oncoming boat. And also you have to realize that you can't just tack into a boat. So if you're the leeward boat, you can't just tack into the windward boat. They have to have time to respond. So those are some of the general rules, and these this handful of rules right here will keep you out of trouble most of the time. Rule 14, which is another, basically is an important one, but basically it's talking about avoiding contact. And so one of the things that a lot of people don't realize, and I think it was Mike Bogue said it last time, but the rules are designed to be a shield. The rules are not designed to be a weapon or a sword. Rule 14, avoiding contact, is really king, and you'll find out even if you're traveling at regattas and so forth, and in a lot of cases, they don't like to, it doesn't matter what happened, they don't like to see contact. And so you want to avoid contact if at all possible at any time. A lot of people get caught up in a lot of this information. You read it and it doesn't seem overly clear. I've got a different instruction here I wanted to take a look that really has to do a lot with, it's because it's got some diagrams of things. Again, we'll put all of this information out. If you were at the Chalk Talks last year, I used some of this. And so as we're looking at the opposite tacks, I mean, even though they're talking about the mark being here, this is a case where you've got the starboard boat, he's got right away, port boat has to avoid. So the port boat could, and here he's either tacking below, or if he could stall the boat enough, he can wait and go behind him to get to the mark. But bottom line is the starboard boat has right of way. Again, I mean, the boat here, we talk about tacking. He's talking about tacking in the zone. One of the things that we didn't talk a lot about, but when they changed the rules in 2017, the old 2 boat length circle became 3 boat lengths. And they now, instead of calling it the 3 boat length circle, they call it the zone. But essentially, a lot of the things that we see within the zone on an upwind are not that much different than when you're not in the zone. You find that most of the time, I mean, the tacking boat doesn't really have rights here. I mean, so in this case, the boat was coming to port. This boat, he had to luff up to avoid, and that would be a foul. You can't do that when you're tacking, even though he's tacking to starboard. So he had to either avoid here, or he caused this boat to luff. That would be a foul with the boat that was on port. So upwind sailing, I think, tends to make sense to most people. Where I really wanted to get to, and tonight from here, was when we look at the leeward mark, because that's where I think a lot of people tend to get more confused. When we look at the leeward mark, it makes sense to us. Okay, so we're rounding the mark, got 2 boats that are overlapped and they're both on the same tack. Inside boat has right of way, boats around. That makes sense to everybody. But I think sometimes we get confused when we are talking about the leeward mark and we're coming in. You might notice this boat is on port. He's got an overlap. They're in their 3 boat length circle. So the overlap is generally established across the transom of a boat. And so there'd be this invisible line that's heading out here. This boat's clearly inside. Even though this boat is on starboard and the other boat's on port, he can't just head into the mark and pinch this boat out. The port boat has to be given room to jibe. But if you read this, it says it must jibe at the first reasonable opportunity. So in other words, the port boat, just because he's got inside rights, he can't sail down here and then do their thing. You need to make a reasonable rounding of the mark. And so the starboard boat can't just head in here and pinch them out. Again, I mean, this one makes more sense to people because in this case, the outside boat is on, or the inside boat is on starboard. So of course he gets room to come and around the mark. People tend to get that one. Where I think people get more confused is here. When the inside boat is on port, when they have that inside overlap at the leeward mark, they still have rights. And I've seen that play out more than one time. And again, in this case, both boats are on the same tack. So this is a case here where both boats, so the windward has to stay clear. The inside boat is expected to jibe at the earliest opportunity. So we're gonna talk a little bit more about this kind of maneuvering when we talk probably in the third chalk talks, when I'm going to talk a little bit more about tactics and so forth. And because one of the things is everybody seems to think, oh well, the inside boat is king, inside boat is ruler. Well, that's true from a rights standpoint. The inside boat does have the rights, but we're going to talk a little bit more about mark rounding and how it's not always the most advantageous to be the inside boat, and or how we deal with not getting caught to the outside necessarily or unnecessarily, I'll say. So when we talk about the rules, like I said, I think that the biggest key that people get confused on with the 3 boat length circle and the leeward mark is that the starboard boat doesn't just have all the rights to force people to go wherever. Unlike when you're on the windward. And the windward, things tend to make a little bit more sense, but in the downwinds, I think is when people tend to get more confused. I didn't spend a lot of time on the rules, but I guess part of that was because we did cover some of it last year, some of the similar things, and showed some videos. Again, so the sailing instruction, the U.S. sailing rules, this is available from the website. I'm going to ask Susan to make this available as well. And we talked about the race instructions. This is a copy of the instruction for the race committee that is available on there. So it talks a lot more in depth about all of the things, shows some of the courses. That's where I borrowed some of the information from. And then this also is where I was saying I got the race sequence from. So again, that information is available on the website. Talks about the Wednesday night starting sequence. So that's where I said we were having a different, and having the open fleet start first. And then talks about the time limits. Here is where somebody mentioned the 30 minutes to the first mark. That is in there. So again, if you haven't read this, it talks about the flags and flying the checkers when we do abandonments. So I'd recommend everybody get a chance to take a look at that as well. And I guess at this point, I'm going to stop sharing, and I don't know if I went too fast or if I didn't go fast enough, if I didn't cover enough of who wanted what. Time for comments or whatever.
Come here with puppy.
I heard somebody, but barely.
I have a comment. This is Bruce.
Yep.
A few states now are making it law that you have to use the dead man switch on a powerboat.
A what?
Use the kill switch. Typically, we don't do that. Might be an idea that, at least on the crash boat, we actually do clip the kill switch onto the operator of the boat.
We have to actually install it.
Sorry?
Yes, we do. It's that red bungee cord.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of people don't clip it to themselves.
Oh,
Just leave it on the boat. If you fall out, the boat will come around and run over you.
Oh.
I see what you're saying.
Yeah,
Yes,
it's worth thinking about.
Yep.
Sometimes if you're moving around the boat, you can't really do it, but I know in some states now it's a legal requirement on a powerboat that you have to have it clipped to a person.
Close.
Where are you? Ah, I see you.
What?
Guess that's something we'll have to follow up with.
I
We
know
are
it's
actually next week going to talk more about the crash boat, but that wasn't one of the items.
No, it's not, as far as I know, it's not law in Michigan, but it is in some states now.
Yeah.
His father was in Kansas 12 times before.
Wow. It's not
Okay.
Are we gonna go over, if your race committee,
There's a lot of older people.
when do you call the race off?
That's actually in the
So, no.
instructions. I can show it real quick again if I share. I just got to find it. Race abandonment. Everybody see my screen?
No?
No.
You know.
So, yeah.
Okay.
What did I do wrong?
Oh, you don't.
I thought I did. No.
No,
You see it now? All right.
Yep.
I thought I hit the button, but apparently didn't take. So in the race instruction, it actually spells out, I mean, minimum conditions for starting the race or maximum conditions. But there is also in here the conditions for abandonment. And so we have set the club rules that if we're looking at 20 plus mile an hour and it's gusting over 25, then that's time for abandonment. Or obviously if we have a storm front that's approaching and or if lightning is or was visible, we now have the lightning detector, I believe, that will detect lightning within a 25-mile radius. And so I think if that goes off, that's cancellation. It was interesting, and I'm just going to put this out there because one of the races that I ran last year, I think it was last year, the lightning detector that, I mean, we had it on and the lightning detector never went off. I had somebody, and I don't remember who it was now, it doesn't matter, but somebody had on their phone was claiming that they had a lightning detector on their phone and that it went off a couple of times. And I don't know, I guess all I'm saying is that to my knowledge, the club lightning detector is official. I don't know anything about the accuracy of lightning detectors on phones. I have no idea. I didn't even know they had such a thing. So, but they were concerned that I didn't cancel the race because their phone went off twice, and I said, well, we watched the lightning detector like a hawk, and it never went off. So. Does that answer your question, Mike?
Yep.
Okay. Again, I'd recommend, if you haven't had a chance to read these, it spells out a lot of things pretty plainly. And like I said, the abandonment conditions in there and so forth, to try to take, put some finite things together as to when races can be run and when they should be abandoned.
And you want to go over early?
OCS?
Over
So,
early?
Yeah, it's called OCS now. Yep. So
Oh,
over early is called on course side, basically, is what OCS stands for. So generally speaking, over early, you have to restart. It depends on the club. We do not have in our race instructions, if you're over early, you can dip back behind the line. You do not have to go around the end unless the 1 minute rule, or something is in effect. We don't normally run that on our races as a general rule of thumb. So you can get back behind the line. One of the reasons, though, to go around the end is if you go around the end, then there's no question that you were cleared. It is not actually up to the race committee or to the people on the safety boat, either one of them. It's not actually up to them to inform a boat if they are over early, but it can be done as a courtesy. Okay, so if a boat, in our case, I mean, they could be over early at 10 seconds to go, but if they get back behind the line and then then the start goes, they're okay. So in our case, OCS is only if they're over the line when the start happens. Okay. We do normally, as a courtesy, tell people who is over, if possible. Sometimes we'll send the crash boat to holler at them if they didn't hear us. But again, it's not technically a requirement. It is actually up to the sailors to ensure that they are behind the line at the start. Does that cover that?
well, yeah, and if you're OCS, you have no rights?
That's correct. Yeah, from a sailing aspect, if you're OCS, at that point, it's essentially like you've committed a foul. And so in that case, you don't really have any rights. So in other words, you can't interfere with other boats to just peel off and restart. So there's, and that causes some problems for people, because a lot of times people, when they realize they're OCS, then they, cause all kinds of havoc trying to get back to restart. And that shouldn't happen. It does, unfortunately, but it should not happen.
Kevin, to
One
be clear,
of the things that a lot of people, I think, don't think about sometimes, though, if you're OCS and you're trying to get out of the way as much as you can, sometimes you just have to point. I mean, if you have room to do so, you either have to just point the boat into the wind and luff it to slow it down so everybody can go by and then you can get back. Or if you're leeward, sometimes you got to let the sail out and just stall the boat to get around so that you can restart. So
Kevin, to be
but yes, when you are OCS, you don't have any rights until you have restarted.
We normally have a flag for OCS, but do we know if that's required?
In our race instructions, we do have it. We do have the flag. I don't know if we have it in this race instruction or not. I don't think we do, because for club racing, we don't typically worry about it too much.
Yeah.
I think it's in there anyway.
Is it in here?
I'm not
believe
sure
so.
exactly where, but I know it's in there.
I'm looking to see if I can find it. I didn't remember.
Okay, so to be clear, your OCS, you have no rights. You don't have to be told, and we allow for dipping.
Yes.
Okay. So you could sail backwards, get over the line, and do it again.
Yes, we do have in here. Let me share a screen again. Try it. See if I can do a better job this time. So we do have information in here about the general recall. So this is the bottom of page 7 of the information that's on there. So it does talk about the single X for an additional horn for individual recalls. And it talks about down here, if you're going to do a general recall. I don't think in fleet racing I've ever seen a general recall. We have had some cases of individuals that were over the line. Typically, we haven't even had, I mean, usually the message gets passed down the line pretty fast. So I don't know if I've ever seen a case where we flew the I flag or the X.
Yeah, I've flown it before.
So, okay.
Kevin,
But
somebody,
the information's in there.
Kevin, somebody had a question about the timing of lightning, and I came across the formula. It's 5 seconds per mile between the visual lightning and the thunder. So for every 5 seconds between the light of the lightning strike and the sound of the thunder, 5 seconds equals a mile. I hope that answers the question.
So, okay.
Thanks.
Anything else?
I have just, I guess, a statement that if there's other things you think we need to learn, I mean, as this summer drags out and we maybe sail, maybe don't, you know, maybe we'll do some more of these in June, July, August, hopefully not, but it's possible.
Mhm.
If there's something you want to know.
We might could even do them in person by then.
Yeah. Right. We could. So if you, but we might not be able to sail because we might not have permits. We like my favorite saying is the only thing we know is we don't know.
Yep.
So, you know, let us know and we can try and work on that.
Mm-hmm. So. Anyone else?
So Kevin, just one note. While we might not use the general recall and the I-flag much in our club, in Seascale regattas, especially if there's big wind, out of 6 races, there's going to be 2 or 3 general recalls, and the I-flag is probably going to be used. So it's quite common in Seascales.
Yeah, I've experienced a few of those. So.
Hey.
So Sue, I don't. either later tonight or tomorrow morning, I'll send you all of this information. Like I said, some of it's already available on the web, but I'll send it to you and then you can either email it or post it, however you guys want to do it.
I think we'll email it. That way it's in at everybody's fingers.
I'll print it in PDF just so the file sizes aren't big.
No se puede con las bendis, ¿ah? Estar encerrado. ¡Cállate!
All right, well, it's great to see everybody,
Yeah.
even if it's like this.
Better than not seeing everybody.
Better than nothing.
There's nobody missing, right?
Yep.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Susan.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Nice seeing your faces again.
Putting it on.
We'll see
All
you
right.
next.
Some of them anyway.
I didn't show everybody. I said I did wear my sailing shirt tonight.
All right.
Pull that thing, pull this thing.
Oh, that's good. That other thing.
That's nice.
Not that thing, the other thing.
I like that.
The other
Fantastic.
new line.
Can I get one of those for Pat?
Yep. So, all right. Well, have a great night.
Thank you.
See you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye, guys. Thank you, guests.
Bye. Where's the game?
It's ending meeting.
Yeah.
Leave meeting.